One of the best professions is the paramedic. They are phenomenal when it comes to situational awareness. They turn up to the crash scene, they see ultimately all of a sudden there's a car that's turned over, there's a light pole that's down, they're then in a position ultimately they can see fuel leaking and they know they've got one passenger in the car. What do? They run up to that particular car and just before they begin, they say, Mr. and Mrs. Owner, just before I begin today, would you like to see where I'm ranked in the top 100 paramedics? We and I both know they don't do that. What they do really, really well is they have incredible situational awareness about what's actually going on. And we too should do exactly the same before we go to a listing presentation. A job relocation is super easy to list. You know that ultimately you've got a seller who has to sell. They're moving overseas. They ultimately need to sell the property and they want to make a decision on the agent they're going to choose in the course of like the next 24 hours. But not every market appraisal that you go to is actually going to be that. You might actually turn up to a market appraisal, which turns out to be that person who's going to be the aspirational seller. Now, what's the aspirational seller? You know the type. They don't need to sell, except if they find something they like, then they might sell. And ultimately, what you've got to do is you've got to develop the need around the reasons why they would actually go to do a transaction. Now, if you go back to Ari Weinstein's basic change formula, people have got to have a high level of dissatisfaction. They've got to have vision about where they'd like to go. And then they ultimately need to be doing all of the first steps to really go to make all that happen. You sometimes actually need to work someone's dissatisfaction or to help them to establish a vision that motivates them to do more of the first steps that really matter. So how do we do that? Let's say, for example, that you are working with that aspirational seller. Hannah, let me just ask you a really simple question. Is there anything missing in your current house? Yes, there is, Josh. I'd love like an extra living area. And is there anything else that you'd love? Well, to be honest, I'd love a little bit more natural light. And Hannah, how much would you pay for something like that? An extra $1 million. So yours is worth 3. You're looking to find something for 4 that's got an extra living area and ultimately has got a little bit more natural light. How soon would you like to do something like that? Well, not that soon, but ultimately I do want to do it. Well, why is it, Hannah? Why do you want to do it? You know the reason why I want to do it? I've been in my house for like 11 years now, and I just really want that feeling of progress and that feeling of change. Maybe it's time to ultimately spice things up again. You see what actually happened in just a couple of quick questions. Hey, literally, is there anything missing in your current house? Tell me a little bit more about that. Is there anything else? What would you pay for that? Oh, and by the way, why is that? Like, why do you want them to do the move? Now you've actually got them in a position that they're really motivated and they're actually in a position that they want to go and act. Your job as a great real estate agent is to realize that you're going to walk into one of 11 different situations. There are people that's growing family. You're going to have a divorce. You're going to ultimately walk into deceased estate. You're going to go to sell for developers. You're going to sell for investors. You're going to sell for people that are under financial pressure. You're then ultimately going to sell for people that are in a position that they're going to do some sort of job relocation. Ultimately, you might even be selling for people that are going to do like a sea or a tree change. You might be working for people that have got like a nursing home event that's going on, or even someone who's in a position that ultimately they're very aspirational about selling. Or our final one is ultimately having to downsize because the kids have ultimately moved out. What we know is that those first 8 reasons are much more urgent than the last 3. And it doesn't mean that the last 3 won't come to market. It just means that you've got to learn how to ask better questions to help them to realize the reasons why they should ultimately sell. And that's the skill in having phenomenal situational awareness.